There's fine. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I am so excited to see all of you here tonight for the annual Klatsky Endowed Lecture in Human Rights. This is the 16th year that we have given this lecture and that we have given out our Cox International Law Center Humanitarian Award for Advancing Global Justice. This award has been called in the press Cleveland's Nobel, and we have been very fortunate to have Klatsky lecturers and the recipients of this award in the past who have been among the leading figures fighting the good fight for human rights law. We have had in the past two high commissioners for human rights. We've had Albie Sachs from South Africa, who was part of tearing down apartheid. We've had prosecutors of international courts, judges of international courts, and today we are very, very fortunate to have somebody who, both in the NGO world, started the preeminent NGO of lawyers who fight for human rights around the world, and then later served as the Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights in the Obama administration. You see a picture of him talking to the president with his Cleveland Nobel Prize in the lower corner. Let me tell you a little bit about how this all came about. This law school has been extremely fortunate. We have our International Law Center supported for the last 25 years by the Gund Foundation grant, and we've been able to do extraordinary things, and because of that, we are highly ranked among international law programs in the United States. One of the alums of the university is Bruce Klatsky, and he was a trustee, he was a corporate president, and he cared very deeply about human rights. He was on the board of Human Rights Watch, and he wanted to do something special for this school. And so what he did is he negotiated where Human Rights Watch takes every year two of our students for summer internships. And they pretty much take them from the top law schools and Case Western. We've had 32 of our students launch their careers in the human rights world, and they have launched, and they've gone on and done amazing things. The other thing that Bruce Klatsky did when he endowed us was he created this lecture, and it made it possible for us to bring these people here to Cleveland to talk about some of the most important things that can be said in the world. And so if those of you who were here a year ago remember that we had Prince Zaid, the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights, speaking about bigotry in national elections on the eve of the Republican National Convention, and that was reported in over 1,000 newspapers around the world. Now, today's lecture will be introduced by Professor Avi Cover. He runs our Institute for Global Security Law and Policy. I'm very happy to report that this year he was unanimously voted tenure by our faculty, so he'll be around for a very long time. And he has done great things for our international law program. So he's going to be introducing the speaker, and then we will be giving him his award, and then you are in for a treat. I will tell you as a preview, originally when this speech was envisioned, it was going to be about corporate responsibility for human rights, but there is so much else going on that is front page news in the world of human rights, so we're probably going to be steering into some other areas as well. But without further ado, let me turn it over to Professor Cover.
Hi. So when I first started working at Human Rights First, I did what I'm sure all of you soon-to-be lawyers will do. I got up early on my second day of work, really early. I was going to be the first one in the office. And so I went up to the 13th floor of Human Rights First, and I shook the two glass doors, you remember them, to open up. They didn't open. I shook a little harder, and suddenly the alarm went off. Ear-splitting, piercing alarm. So I did what anyone would do in that situation. This is long ago enough that I didn't have a cell phone. I raced down the stairs. So 13 floors, I figured I would either escape or perhaps tell someone downstairs, that the alarm is going off. But the stairwell door was locked when I got to the bottom. So I sort of trudged back up the 13 flights and tried to do whatever I could do, and I'm a lawyer, so I couldn't really do anything about an alarm going off in the doors. And so I just sort of sat glumly waiting outside the doors when Mike Posner showed up to sort of, open the doors to the office, if you will. And I don't know, Mike, you had probably already run 5 miles and what have you that morning. It looked very chipper, but the alarm is still going off at an ear-piercing split. And he said, "What happened? You set the alarm off?" I said, "Yep." He said, "Don't worry about it. I'm glad you're here early. Let's get to work." And that, in so many ways, I think embodies Mike's work ethic, Mike's approach to dealing with people, to dealing with challenge. Michael Posner is the Jerome Kohlberg Professor of Ethics and Finance and a Professor of Business and Society at NYU's Stern School of Business. And he's the co-founder, as Michael mentioned, of the first human rights center within a business school, the Center for Business and Human Rights at New York University Stern. And as Michael also mentioned, prior to joining NYU Stern, he was the Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor from 2009 to 2013. And prior to that, for the better part of 30 years, he led Human Rights First, what was originally titled or named Lawyers Committee for Human Rights. Throughout his career, Mike has been a prominent voice in support of human rights protections in global business operations in the manufacturing supply chain, the extractives industry, and the information and communications technology sector. Moreover, he's played an incredible role in changing the law in our society, helping to create the first U.S. law providing for political asylum in the United States, which became part of the Refugee Act of 1980, as well as the Torture Victim Protection Act, which was adopted in 1992. He also led Human Rights First delegation to the Rome Conference, which led to the statute of the International Criminal Court. On a just additional personal note, working with Mike at Human Rights First for about 4 years was truly just a eye-opening and life-changing experience for me. Mike is first among all attributes a mensch. I was privileged to watch a master at advocacy and human rights, at bringing coalitions together to fight for significant changes to the law. But one of the most impressive things I learned from Mike is that dedication to human rights doesn't require the bloviating or shrill cries of denunciation and polarization. Something that we can need to remember, I think, in these particular times on whatever side of the aisle you are. Mike's always demonstrated a commitment to the fight for the downtrodden while being willing to talk with and even work with the other side, regardless of whether they're strange bedfellows, such as strategically uniting with former military leaders against U.S. interrogation practices that rose to the level of torture and ultimately led to President Obama's signing an executive order prohibiting the use of torture and other such interrogation tactics. He helped create the Fair Labor Association, an organization that brings together corporations, local leaders, universities, and NGOs to promote corporate accountability for working conditions in the apparel industry. He's always said it's critical for the U.S. to engage with countries and leaders who may have violated human rights, opening up a channel to dialogue and to change. Though Mike may speak in an even-tempered and mild voice, his heart and commitment are deep and passionate. I'm thrilled, therefore, to introduce my friend and present him the Klatsky Award to my friend and mentor, Mike Posner.
So, Michael Posner, for your lifelong achievements in the field of human rights, for doing so much to make the world a better place, I am very honored to present you the 2017 Cox International Law Center Humanitarian Award for Advancing Global Justice. We will put this behind you.
Okay, that's great.
And we look forward to your remarks.
All right. Wow. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Avi, why didn't we give you a key? First of all, it's a pleasure. It's a great honor and a pleasure to be here, to be with Dean Scharf, who's been a friend and colleague for many, many years and who's doing a fabulous job here. And right back at you, Avi. When Avi in 2004 came to Human Rights First, we were in a very tough time because of what had been in my mind, an overreaction and an improper reaction to some of the national security threats we faced. And we were struggling to figure out ways to respond to the torture issues that Avi mentioned, the detention of people at Guantanamo, a whole range of things which were pretty unprecedented in our history. And what we needed were thoughtful, smart lawyers and advocates who put their talents to work in a way that would be effective. And we were absolutely thrilled when we were able to recruit Avi, and he did really a fabulous job with us. So I know that those attributes of both legal acumen and judgment and a strong moral compass are he's brought to Case Western Reserve, and you're really lucky to have him. I also am really thrilled to be giving the Klatsky lecture. I actually met and worked with Bruce Klatsky and his team in the mid-1990s when we set up the Fair Labor Association. And much to his credit, he was then, and was for I think 13 or 14 years, the CEO of PVH, which used to be Phillips Van Heusen, which was a big apparel and footwear manufacturer. There weren't very many companies that wanted to get in the middle of that fight or in the middle of that discussion. And there were some of the companies like Nike and Reebok that were very much in the spotlight. PVH didn't have to be at the table. And yet in 1996, when President Clinton invited apparel industry executives to the White House, Bruce Klatsky was one of the people who came and stayed and was part of the effort to really look at the sweatshop issue in a responsible way. And so it's really an honor to be giving this lecture in the name of Bruce Klatsky. What I want to do today is say something broadly about the field that I'm now working in. For the last 4 years since I left government, I've gone to a business school, which was my first real experience in the business world directly, and we've set up with a colleague a Center on Business and Human Rights at NYU Stern, which is the first human rights center at a business school. And I want to say something about the landscape in which we're operating, and then some broader things about where we are in this political moment. I told Michael and Avi that I was here in November. I had worked with Secretary Clinton in government, and I supported her during the campaign. I came to Cleveland for 5 days to try to get out votes. And it made me realize here and elsewhere how divided our country is and how much issues relating to trade and labor are affecting our politics. I want to say something about that later, but I want to first start with some good news. When I teach my classes, the first things that I talk about are the ways in which economic human rights have been improved and affected in the last 35 or 40 years. And so if you look at where the world was in 1980, I'm using World Bank statistics, half of the world's population was living in extreme poverty. That means on $1.25 a day. Now that number has gone down by 2 billion people in the last 35 years. In East Asia alone, in 1980, 77% of the population was living below the extreme poverty level. Now that number is below 14%. That's mainly a China story, and it's a remarkable achievement. The UN last year passed something called the Sustainable Development Goals, and they say by 2030 the objective is to eliminate extreme poverty. I don't know if we're going to get there, but if you think about broadly human rights, the reduction of poverty and the elimination of extreme poverty in our world is an amazing accomplishment. Part of the reason for that, in fact, I would say the most important reason for that, has been the globalization of the economy and the creation of jobs. Much more than the World Bank or USAID or DFID, it's the creation of jobs for people who were not working in a moneyed economy 30 or 35 years ago is really what's propelling that change. And so when we look at a globalized economy, there's a lot of debate about globalization, But we have to recognize for countries in less developed places, this has been a remarkable period of growth, and the expansion of a global commercial economy has been a driver of change. There's also been things in our own society. We pay lower prices as consumers for food, for clothing, and for other products. We have greater markets for our products. And there are a range of ways in which an expanded pool of qualified workers, say in the tech industry, is making us stronger. And yet, despite all of this, we're at a point now where what Larry Summers has called a revolt against global integration is taking place. So I want to take a few minutes and probe a little bit. Why are we in a place where, in spite of all this positive news that I've just described, we're really seeing so much pushback against a globalized economy? Well, I think there are three overlapping forces that make that happen. The first is the disparity between rich and poor. We know that that's happening, but the numbers are really quite shocking. Oxfam did a paper in January where they said that the 8 richest people on our planet have as many resources, $1.7 trillion, as the bottom 50%. That's 3.5 billion people. When you look at the 1% richest people in the world, they have more money than the rest of us, all 7 billion of us. In the next 20 years, there are 500 people that are going to pass on more than $2 trillion to their heirs. That's more than the GDP of India. And so you have this great disparity between the very, very rich and the rest of us. And that is in some ways even growing. Any one of the 500 CEOs of American Fortune 500 companies are earning as much in a year as 10,000 people working in garment factories in Bangladesh. Even if you go to a place like Vietnam, the richest man there earns more in a day than the poorest person earns in 10 years. So you have this huge disparity of wealth. And in our own society, the top 1% over the last 30 years of their income and wealth has gone up by 300%. For the bottom 50% in our society, there's been zero growth. So this is not a global problem that affects only people out there. This is a thing that we have to cope with at home. The second driver of this discontent is what I would call weak national governance in less developed countries. We have a huge gap between poor countries that are not protecting their own people and rich global companies that come into that situation. So if you look at the 100 biggest, if you compare gross domestic product of states and revenues of private companies, half of the biggest economies of the world are not states, they're private companies. Walmart, with annual revenues now of almost $500 billion, is the 23rd biggest economy in the world. Its revenues are equal to the gross domestic product of Nigeria or Poland or Belgium. I kept saying to people in the State Department, why do we have an ambassador to Benin and we don't have an ambassador to Walmart? Is there any doubt if you're looking at who's really affecting the world? I never got an answer to that. But these global firms rely on expanded supply chains, whether it's manufacturing, farming, fishing, natural resource collection, and they are in some ways being driven by our demands, by consumer demands for cheaper products, which are causing their governments to be less attentive to the protection of their own people. The third factor, which is, I think, breeding this discontent, is the perception that global brands and retailers are racing to move their operations offshore, in part to lower costs, but also to circumvent labor and environmental safeguards and controls. I think the leaders of a lot of the largest companies are contributing to this narrative by in effect outsourcing responsibility to sourcing agents, local managers, buyers, and others who don't keep them fully aware of what they're doing. So to give one example, our center's done a couple of years of study of the supply chain in the garment factory in Bangladesh. Factory collapsed in 2013, 5 weeks after we arrived at NYU at Rana Plaza. And we spent 2 years really studying what's going on. One of the things we learned is that the supply chain, the 200 big companies that are in Bangladesh, by the way, it's the second biggest garment center in the world after China. It's 80% of the export income. And it's people go there because the minimum wage is now $60 a month. It was 2 years ago, $38 a month. It's simply too cheap to avoid. And they have a huge workforce now, 5 to 6 million garment workers, mostly young women. And what we learned is that the global brands and retailers were paying attention to the factories where they had a contract, but they weren't paying attention to their subcontractors. And so the 200 brands and retailers came together. They said, we're going to look at 1,900 factories in Bangladesh. That's our responsibility. They did inspections. And we said, what about subcontracting? And they said, all of them said, well, we have a rule against subcontracting. And we said, no, wait a minute. That's the way you're making that's your business model. You can't be giving a contract to a firm, to a local supplier that has 500 sewing machines to make 1 million product in 6 weeks. You can't do it. And they said, no, but we have a rule against subcontracting. And we said, but we know there's other firms there. They're subcontracting 2, 3, 4 times to get the products done. It took us a year. We had to take 5 databases to play with the data, and then we sent students out into the field in Dhaka, and we came up with 7,100 factories, names and addresses, and we put it on our website. And so the company said, we're shocked to find that they're subcontracting. This is the way in which we need to change the way we operate. So where do we go from here? First, I think it's essential that we move away from a business model and an investment model that is focused on short-term returns. We are living in a world where people on Wall Street in particular are obsessed about quarterly earnings and making it extremely difficult for the best companies. And there are some really good companies who want to do a better job, but they are driven by this unbelievable pressure from the investment community to return on investment every 3 months and keep those prices down. There's a recent study done by McKinsey Global Institute, and they spent a year and a half looking at this, and this is what they concluded. Companies that operate with a true long-term mindset have consistently outperformed their industry peers since 2001 across almost every financial measure that matters. We have got to begin, the United States uniquely in the world, the investment community here is uniquely saying short-term earnings are the goal, are the mantra. We've got to move to a different model. Secondly, companies that are prepared to lead need to begin thinking about working together, and they need to develop industry standards and metrics. Industries are different from one another. What we've done in the human rights world with states can't be just superimposed. Uh-oh, I must have said something. That was coming from Walmart, I think. Are we all set? All right. Glad we're back. Companies that want to lead have to develop industry standards. Companies in every industry have similar problems to each other, but different from other industries. What Bruce Klatsky did 20 years ago with others in the apparel industry is what we need to see now in farming and fishing, in the tech sector, in construction. And these standards and metrics need to give investors, will be a tool to give investors the information they may need to make intelligent choices. Our center's about to release a report, in fact, releasing it right now, we looked at 12 different agencies that are evaluating social in what's called environmental social governance investing. And what we found is that basically the S is missing. The S doesn't really exist. So if you're looking at Bloomberg or Dow Jones or Sustainalytics, what they're all looking at is what companies are promising. They're not looking at company performance. And so we've got to move to a place where we have industry standards and metrics and where there are ways of evaluating companies one against another. Companies should be rewarded for doing the right thing on labor and human rights. Right now, that's not happening. A word on corporate lawyers, including those who are in this school and graduated from this school. Lawyers are another one of my challenges in the work that we're doing because they are so often risk averse. And they're telling their clients to keep their head down and not raise their heads above the parapet. Lawyers should be leading on these issues. Lawyers should be telling clients that a sustainable business approach needs to be one that includes, again, a standards-based and a metrics-based and an accountability-based framework where companies are actually treating this as they treat efficiency or they treat quality control or they treat profitability. This needs to be a central feature of the way companies operate, in which they judge themselves and which others judge them. On a parallel track, and this brings me to the Trump administration, I couldn't avoid, companies are going to act in the best sense when they get a nudge from government. And so one great example to me where the United States has led is in the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. It's 40 years old. It was adopted in 1977. Industry, at least some in industry, embraced that because they didn't like the idea of paying bribes to foreign governments. It's been a model. There is now an anti-bribery statute in the UK. The European Union is now moving in this direction. And as we've now begun to turn the tide by using government regulation, we find that we have a president who has derided the FCPA as a horrible law, and he's just appointed and nominated to be the head of the Security and Exchange Commission, a lawyer named Jay Clayton, who as a chair of a New York City Bar Committee described the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act as anti-competitive for American companies. They have not yet acted to repeal the FCPA, but I have no doubt that there will be a less aggressive enforcement, and there may in fact be efforts to scale it back. That would be a terrible mistake for us to be doing. Similarly, and here they have begun to act, one of the, or a couple of the little-known provisions of the Dodd-Frank Act, which we know in the context of regulating banks and investment firms. Two of the provisions deal with what we call conflict minerals, sections 1502 and 1504, and they basically require companies that are operating in and around the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has had a war going on for decades and where millions of people have died. There are a range of minerals, precious minerals, that are mined in the Congo, and there is now a federal law, federal regulation, part of Dodd-Frank, that requires companies, and these tend to be tech firms, because the minerals are tungsten and tin, titanium, that are in our cell phones, in our computers. Those firms have to report every year to the SEC on what they're doing to prevent conflict minerals being part of their supply chain. The Trump administration has indicated that they are going to repeal that. It is not wise for the United States to be doing these things. The United States should lead, and among the many challenges we face with this new administration, the intensity of their dislike of regulation and their willingness to yield on things like this, I think bodes very poorly, and we need to fight against them. On a broader plan, I want to just say a few words about trade and labor, and then I'm going to stop and we can have a conversation, and I'm eager to get your questions and thoughts. We had a lot of debate in the election about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I was at the convention in Philadelphia, the Democratic convention, and the only banners that you could see were TPP with a line through them. And I thought to myself, imagine a year ago, people, thinking that the one thing that was going to be debated politically was something called the TPP, which nobody had ever heard of. The TPP was, in a way, a surrogate for a much broader discussion about trade and labor. What do we do about a globalized economy? How does it affect American jobs? And so what we really need to be doing is taking apart that discussion and having a discussion about what do we do in this environment where we have a globalized economy where people are losing jobs. How do we reconcile free trade and the state of the American workforce? A good colleague and friend of mine, Karen Tramontano, has just written a very thoughtful piece. She worked for the AFL, she worked in the Clinton White House, and she has basically written a piece. It's called Tearing Up Trade Agreements Won't Help Workers, a More Responsible Approach Just Made. She says three things. One is that we've got to build a more robust social safety net for American workers who lose their jobs for whatever reason. We cannot just assume, as we've done in the past with some of our legislation, that this is only about outsourcing of jobs. We live in an increasingly technologically advanced world. Lots of people are losing jobs for a range of reasons. We've got to have a national policy that recognizes that, addresses that. It includes job training and relocation, but there's got to be a safety net for people in mid-career or later who lose their jobs and simply don't have the opportunity to find another place. That's an essential element. It's going to cost money, and I think it's incumbent on us to have a smart discussion of how that's going to be done and how it's going to be funded. The second piece that she recommends, and I entirely agree, is that we need stronger and better enforcement of labor regulations globally. The TPP, ironically, was the first trade agreement that brought environmental and labor standards into the formal agreement itself. Unlike NAFTA or CAFTA, it said that every one of the 11 countries, for example, had to have free trade unions. I can assure you that Vietnam and Malaysia don't have free trade unions. And yet the agreement, by its terms, said that within 5 years they were going to be required to do that. The problem with the TPP and the Obama administration's approach to it is that there was no real strategy for implementing that in a serious way. We need trade agreements. I believe in free trade, but we've got to also have a piece of that that recognizes that we have an affirmative obligation in our bilateral relations with countries to make sure that these sorts of trade provisions, these trade agreements, also include labor protections that are real. And the final component of Karen Tramontano's framework is to increase development assistance, to have a very particularized program that works with governments like Bangladesh, like Cambodia, that are weak on these issues, either because they don't have the resources, they don't have the expertise, often they don't have the will, but let's put them to the test. Let's support local rights activists in those countries. Let's put our expertise to work. Let's put resources behind building those capacities so that we have a more level playing field. A lot of work needs to be done in this agenda, but I think we're at a point where we have two choices. One is that we can develop this range of alternatives. The other is that we can, as some want to do, build walls, impose tariffs, and retreat from the 21st century economic system that we've helped to build and that we've been the greatest beneficiaries of. To me, the choice is clear. We need to be a part of the world. We need to engage on trade, but we need to do so in a way that takes seriously our commitment to our own people and doesn't leave millions of hardworking Americans behind. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael. We have microphones somewhere for people to ask questions. Just wait until we get the microphone to you. So we're recording these. Right over here.
My name is Majd Al-Ataibi. I'm from Saudi Arabia, international student here at law school. My question is that I'm doing a dissertation about the protection of foreign direct investment, which is involving a multinational corporation when they invest in my country. So there is like a debate between the countries who export the capitals and the developing countries. They want the investment. They want to create a privilege for their companies to inside the developing countries to get advantage of them, like they provide low wage for the workers and a lot of violations, some of them related to human rights. So again, my question is that how we can, like, as a student from developing country, I want the multinational corporations, they own the technology, they own the skills, come to my country, but I want to protect at the same time my people. So how can we do that? I hope you get my question.
Yeah, no, I do. And let me answer it in two different ways. Um, what you describe in the Arabian Gulf context, I could take out in other areas as well. I think of, for example, the mining companies in Africa. There's so many natural resources, and there's often, again, an inequality of bargaining power or leverage. Countries are so eager to get the revenue, and there are agreements reached, as you're suggesting, that are not equitable or fair and don't return enough money to the local people in the places where those resources are being derived. That's a real challenge. I know that some people have begun, there's actually a senior lawyers project in the United States which has started to represent some of the developing country governments with top flight legal talent so that those negotiations are a bit fairer. But to date, there's been a lot of exploitation, and what you're saying is absolutely true. And I think, again, this is a place where our government should not be standing on the sideline. I said to Michael and Avi that one of the things that was really striking to me as a U.S. government official paying attention to these things was how passive or uninvolved a lot of American officials were, whether at trade or whether at commerce or treasury, U.S. trade representatives or the State Department, in sort of monitoring and policing how American companies interact with governments around the world. I think not only for the United States, but I think for all of the developing countries, the more developed countries, there ought to be some global, I'm a big believer that we ought to have some global, what I call rules of the road, to dictate the kind of thing you're describing doesn't happen. Let me just say one other thing, though, about the region, which is not your question, but it's also an important piece. We're about to do a report looking at the recruitment practices from South Asia to the Gulf for construction. And there's something in the order of 25 million workers from India, from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, from Nepal, a lot of them coming to Saudi, a lot of them coming to Qatar, the UAE, and they're paying a recruitment fee. We spent, again, a year and a half looking at this, mostly on the South Asian side. What we found is that these workers are basically recruited often from rural areas, and they are paying a recruiting fee, which is often the equivalent of a year or even 2 years of wages. They take out a loan, and they're basically working for free. And that's something that is a problem that's caused by the Gulf state governments. It's a lack of attention, again, by the South Asian governments, which are competing with each other for the remittance dollars. So the Indian government, the Bangladesh government are not protecting their own people. And you have Western construction firms and Western hotels and the World Cup, FIFA, benefiting from the fact that these workers are getting there for free. there's no cost to them in the recruitment. It's not a fee-for-service business. So this is an area where I think there needs to be cooperation among Gulf governments, South Asian governments, and the private sector. This is one of those areas that has not been studied as much as it should, and I'm hoping that we can begin to stir up some conversation. You asked one question, I gave you two different answers, but there you are. Please, others.
Thank you. I'd like to comment on the last answer. I think what you really need to do is if a country wants to export your minerals or stuff, you have to do what was done years of City of Cleveland. They want to bring all their managers. No. You train people so that the next contract, I may be the secondary manager. On the third or fourth one, I could actually run this operation. But the question I'm going to ask is, years ago, it's from what you said, it sounds like labor was more important and more fungible than capital. Now it's flipped the other way around where, you know, the money basically controls and rules everything, and we'll get the labor wherever.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, first of all, on your first point, I think it's absolutely right that one of the answers to the question about how less developed countries protect their resources is essentially, again, a skills question and an experience question. And it is why one of the things Karen Tramontano talked about is doing the kind of training in developing countries of managers, lawyers, people are going to negotiate those contracts so that the country gets a fair deal. I think it's absolutely right, and we haven't done enough of that. On the labor issue, there's just no question that labor costs in a place like Bangladesh or in a place like Cambodia, labor costs are dramatically different. And so global companies are chasing after wherever they find the easiest, the cheapest, the least regulated, and the largest workforce. It's not just a question of the cost, what their wages are, it's also do they have the capacity to produce in volume and quickly. Those are the three criteria for manufacturing. You want to get it at a low price, you want to get it quickly, and you need a high volume. And so that's what's happening in the world. Again, that is where we are, and I think we've got to be mindful of the fact those jobs are not coming back. We're not going to begin doing garment production in the United States. I think we have to look forward and say, how do we respond to that in a way that doesn't disempower people, gives them alternatives, but also have a safety net. We've got to have a safety net for people who are really now struggling. Please.
Yeah, I want to know, how do you extrapolate or balance the human rights issue in terms of these underdeveloped countries, in terms of the World Bank and the loans that are being put out, and the issue around sweatshops? Because there seems to be a dichotomy or oxymoron to have this particular form of trade, and when there's a virulent issue around sweatshops and issues around loan sharking in terms of the World Bank and the IMF. So how do you balance these contradictions relevant to that? As you said before, you're having oversight with people who are paying loans to go to the Arab Peninsula, but there's no pious outcry. There are pious outcries in terms of other things. So is there? I'm talking about how do we get through this? It seems to be kind of hypocrisy. We talk about trade, but we don't actually deal with sanctions around sweatshops or other type of human rights issues that are taking place. The last question was, well, that is a human rights issue if you're saying people are working basically as indentured servants.
Yeah. So there are a couple of things I would say to that. One, I agree with the spirit of your question, which is we have now in the last, again, 30, 35 years, a global economy that's expanded dramatically, and we have not established what I'm talking about, or what I'm calling rules of the road. And so there aren't we don't have enough safeguards or uh, constraints on exploitation. Now, the way in which you do that, there isn't one answer to how you go about doing that. One piece of it, to me, and I said this sort of in passing, is companies have to be judged by investors, by consumers, on the basis of how serious are they about their global operation. So when the factories collapsed, let's go back to Bangladesh. When the factories collapsed in Rana Plaza, every one of the global companies said, oh, those aren't our factories. And then some enterprising reporter walked through the rubble and found Joe Fresh and Walmart and Children's Place. The labels were lying in the rubble. I went there a year later, and there were still labels in the rubble. And the answer was that they weren't paying attention to where their stuff was being produced. They should pay a price for that in terms of public awareness and consumer behavior. It's up to us. You know, at the end of the day, if consumers don't care and investors don't care, then it's hard to feel that companies are going to take this seriously. Second thing I would say, when you mention the World Bank, one of the things we did when we looked at Bangladesh, and we spent a lot of time on this, we said, what's really going to be what is the cost of fixing the factory safety issue? So you have, you know, a very weak infrastructure, you have an almost dysfunctional government, you have lots of factories like the one that collapsed that are built on top of a garage. That was a 2-story building in a swamp. They built 6 stories on top of the 2 illegally, and then they put a 2-ton generator on the roof because there's no reliable electricity. And the building collapsed. Now, you can't expect private industry to be responsible for building the electric grid. So we went to the World Bank and we said, we need a kind of shared responsibility model where governments, the World Bank, foundations, and industry together figure out how to crack this nut, how to solve the problem. You know what the World Bank told us? They said, we've had 3 public projects in Bangladesh. The government's defaulted. We're not going back to do any more. We went to USAID. They said, we're spending 90% of our money in Bangladesh on agriculture. Remember I said to you, 80% of their exports are in garments. Why are they spending 90% on agriculture? Because the aid director is an agronomist. And so we've got to be smarter about this. We can't have this dispersion of energy with everybody doing something different. But I want to come back to your main point, which is it's up to us as consumers, it's up to investors, it's up to the media to make these issues important enough that companies feel they have to do more.
About the legislative process and the Oval Office. It appears to me there can be enforcement or pressure, either legally or otherwise, that can be brought to bear on companies and reining them in terms of you talking about having a particular road and path. Isn't it responsibility of the government to have oversight of these companies if they're running rampant and promoting or exacerbating sweatshops?
Absolutely. And so, again, going back to Bruce Klatsky, in 1996, Robert Reich was the labor secretary. He went to President Clinton and Vice President Gore, and he said, there's an issue with sweatshops. Let's bring Nike and Reebok and PVH and these other companies to the White House. They had a White House meeting in August of 1996 and created something called the President's Apparel Industry Partnership. It was the jawboning from exactly what you say, from the Oval Office. Nobody wanted to be absent when the president called, and that's how the Fair Labor Association started. There is no question that government needs to be involved in this discussion, and right now we have a deficit of leadership in that regard. Please.
You spoke of governments needing to get involved more, and you also spoke about trying to have better enforcement of labor and environmental provisions. What would be the enforcement mechanism for that? And how does one go about doing that without perhaps surrendering a little bit too much sovereignty as far as what legislation one could pass in your own country or in countries all over the world?
So the first answer to that is, we all want to live in a world where 193 governments protect their own people. And then we don't have to worry about sovereignty because everybody's doing their job. We don't happen to live in that world. And so the question is, where do we go from there? One answer is that countries ought to be creative, and countries like the United States ought to see where do we have leverage and where can we make a difference. I cited the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Classic example. We made it a law, a really tough law, that if an American company or a foreign company doing business here is engaged in bribery, they're going to pay a fine. They're going to be prosecuted for that. And it has changed the business environment over 40 years. There's no question. We haven't eliminated corruption, but we've sure made it a lot more risky for a big global company to have people running around the world paying bribes. We could do that in other areas relating to the labor issues I'm talking about. We have now, on the books at least, restrictions on the import of products that are the subject of child labor or forced labor. We have very little enforcement of that. We ought to have, I think, and this is one of the things I fought and lost when I was in government, the government's the largest purchaser of almost everything. If the federal government said our purchasing practices are going to be governed by the following labor standards, we will not buy products that are subject to this or that, and we put some enforcement energy behind that, that would be, companies would all of a sudden start paying attention because the government is such a big customer. It's the largest customer for almost everything. I'm working now with a group that's looking at private security contractors, Swiss initiative, but the U.S. State Department Diplomatic Security Division has said, we're not going to do business with a company that's not part of this association that's looking at human rights. The British Foreign Office has said the same thing. We've barely gotten started, and we have 110 companies that have joined. Why? Because it's their business. The United States and the UK are their biggest customers. So I think we've got to be smart in using the leverage of government appropriately. Where the government's a customer, it has every right to make demands on companies, and that then puts pressure on them to begin to look at their global operation.
The biggest part of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is not U.S. companies bribing foreigners or this or that. It's a person from country A bribing someone in country B and using the American financial system. That's where they catch most of them, isn't it? But it doesn't, one end isn't American, it's just the dollars passed through the U.S. Dollar clearing system, isn't it? Is that right?
Yeah, but it's, when you're saying that, Siemens, which is a German company, was prosecuted for bribing Greek officials. They were fined $300 million for that. So it's not just individuals, it's big global companies doing business in the United States. If you want the privilege of doing business in the United States, you're subject to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and we're going to follow what goes on, even if it doesn't touch the United States, as it did in that case. Please.
First, thanks for being here today. The question I had is, you've talked about leadership from past administrations, whether that was President Clinton and Vice President Gore in the White House summit with Bruce Klatsky as a part of that, or whether it's the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. If we spend the next 4 years going with the one of the two options that you obviously do not like, which is withdrawing from the world stage and building walls, is there, in that vacuum of leadership, other countries that you think will step in and be leaders in the human rights field with corporations, or is there going to be a vacuum for 4 years where there are no rules? And how do you see that going?
Yeah, That's a really good question. You know, the human rights discussion really began in earnest after World War II, after the Holocaust. And it was part of a broader discussion coming out of World War II about establishing a more stable international order. And the United States led on that with some of our Western allies. We created the UN, and the UN had three main purposes. One is security, to prevent more wars. We created a Security Council and all that goes with that. The second was a development agenda, recognizing that when people are really poor and desperate, they're likely to be prime for creating insecurity and participating. And the third was human rights. That was part of yet a broader strategy. You know, the Bretton Woods agreements created the international development banks. We had a refugee order, the humanitarian laws of the Geneva Conventions, all around the same time. It was a global order which the United States led and which has served us unbelievably well. The biggest beneficiary of that post-World War II order has been the United States. Look at where we have gone and how much we've advanced and how strong our society is. The question you ask is the one that actually troubles me the most, because I see us retreating from that commitment. And I see, among others, the Chinese with trying to create a new order with Chinese characteristics. They have a new alternative, an Asian bank, which is an alternative to the World Bank. It's an order that doesn't place a premium on things like human rights, and in fact says to governments, do what you want. This is all about an economic compact. In my experience in government, and I felt this before I went in, but I really felt it when I was in government, on issues like human rights, the United States, for all of its foibles, and boy, I know a lot of the foibles, the United States leads. And governments in the world pay attention. It doesn't mean they always agree with us. It doesn't mean we always win. But we did things in our bilateral relations with the toughest governments that nobody else was willing to do or able to do. And so my fear is, you know, a lot of the European governments, and I have lots of friends and I love them dearly, they love to lead from behind. And they are very keen to be with us, but they don't want to be the ones that take the risk of going out there and creating difficulty in bilateral relations. I was not shy about doing that, and I had the full backing of President Obama and Secretary Clinton. That's our history, and it's a bilateral history. It's Ronald Reagan, it's Bill Clinton, it's Barack Obama, and it's the Bushes. We have always had a sense that this is part of who we are. It's part of our power and strength. It's the power of our ideas and our ideals. So that's really, to me, again, this is not a political speech, but that's really what we're up against now. And I think it is essential as Americans, whatever our party affiliation, that we recognize the power of the American democratic ideal. The world needs it. The world wants it. I've had lots and lots of conversations in tough places where people say, we want and need you to be in the lead, and we risk that right now if we retreat.
Mike, a fairly incredible thought experiment, but President Trump asks you, and you accept, to serve again as Assistant Secretary of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and you're confirmed. What
It's getting more unreal all
what
the
would you
time.
what would you tell the President should be your and the State Department's priorities?
Oh, I think it goes back to what I just said. You know, the key thing is to have a principled commitment to human rights that puts human rights on the table in every country in a similar way. It doesn't mean we don't have other interests, but the thing I fought for so hard and that I think we achieved was to make sure that there were no places where human rights was off limits, that we raised individual cases, that we raised broader concerns, and that if we had a strategic dialogue on economic or other issues, there was always a sense that throughout the government there were people paying attention to this. So that to me is the key, maintaining fidelity to principle, and applying it across the board.
Folks, if anyone has further questions, we'll be joined in the rotunda with Mike Posner for refreshments. Please join me in thanking Mike.